There are two great questions that the modern mind, if we could call it that, asks concerning life. For those who are philosophers, the great question is, why does everything exist? Now, we might think the question is, what is life? That might be our question. But for a philosopher, the great question is, why? Why does anything exist? And I don't really encourage you to read a lot of speculative philosophy, but if you read some of it, you'll discover very quickly this is a question that troubles many, including some who try and say life is meaningless. They can't really get their own minds around that. Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a philosopher from France decades ago, but very influential, tried to say life had no meaning, and you give it meaning by your choices. Well, at the end of his life, he basically said, my philosophy is unlivable. You can't live this way. And so then he was asked, so why don't you just take your life? And he says, well, I probably should, since it's meaningless anyway, but if I take my life, then I'm losing my freedom because I'll be gone. That's the best he could do. Philosophers ask why. The more scientific among us want to know how. That's the big question. How is it that everything exists? And of course, that's been the pursuit of so many, trying to explain the origins of the universe. The how and the why go together, and what's interesting is as we come to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, we begin to find an answer. It's not a popular one with many, for it is an answer that speaks to our reason for existence as well as the means. The reason? Simply God wanted it that way. Life exists because God chose to give life and bring life where there was no life previously outside of his own existence. Life comes from God. Life is an attribute of God, but in terms of our universe, we have life because he has brought life into being in this universe. The means? We began studying it last week. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God simply made everything out of nothing that previously existed. Our last study focused more on the philosophical question. Why? Remember, we looked at the beginning and before. Today, we're going to look a little bit more at the scientific question, although they're clearly intertwined. Let me just review real quickly where we were last week. We started with verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we talked basically about the beginning. This beginning is an absolute beginning for our universe. This should not be interpreted when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form. No, it's not talking about a relative beginning. It's talking about an absolute beginning. Some try and see it as a long period of time. The text does not indicate that. In fact, when you go to chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, and this wraps up when we move to the next section, the next part of the creation story, we find these words basically about the heavens of the earth making this whole section the beginning. So it starts here and continues right on through verse 2 and following. It's the finite beginning of time, of space, of matter, of energy. And we began to look then at the Creator, because this is in the beginning, God created. And we saw him as the infinite one, the one who was pre-existent, who had a plan that he was in fact working out. A plan that had nothing to do with necessity, for he is self-sufficient. A plan that had nothing to do with loneliness, for he was triune, and there was this fellowship of love and communion and promise. He is eternal. His name here, Elohim, is plural, which indicates that triunity that is further on revealed. And now we're about ready to move into the creating of creation. But before we do, I want to say one more thing about the Creator. I want to emphasize this one thing. We talked about it, but I don't think we did enough. And that is this. We talked about God's triune majesty. We talked about His eternality. We talked about the fact that He is powerful, that He has ordained things, that He has a plan from before the foundation of the world, all of these kinds of things. And if we hold those things in our minds, we will tend to emphasize the infinite nature of our God and forget that this is a personal account from a personal God. The great mystery of God is that He is infinite and that He is personal. That combination is brought together so often. I, the Lord, dwell in the high and holy place. Infinite. And also with He who is lowly and contrite of heart. Personal. Love existed before creation. We showed you last week the verse that says, Jesus prayed and says, Father, you loved me before the world began. There was love, an attribute of personality, along with the ability to make decisions. We often talk about intellect, emotion, and will as the signs of personhood. We see all of that in God before the world began. But not only is He a person, but He is personal. Throughout the rest of Genesis, all of this is self-disclosure. God is speaking to Moses, making sure he gets the record straight, gets the record right of this personal unfolding of creation, God's personal involvement. He is not the deist's God who created something and just set it out there, but you see Him like an artist involved. We're going to see the word create in a moment. We're also going to see the word for fashion or shape as we go through this. He made things, but even his making is artistic. It is creative. For He brings it into being, and we're going to argue, and I don't want to steal my thunder for the next 3 weeks or 4 weeks, but He then takes this unfinished earth and begins to shape it and form it much like an artist or a potter. He speaks things into being. He didn't have to speak. He didn't have to do 6 days. It's almost like He's doing this. And you say, well, who's the audience? Well, maybe the angels that He created right away. We'll talk about the angelic creation in a few weeks. But it's almost as if He's trying to let people, persons I should say, angels, others, grasp this. Maybe it's like the person, I'm going to slow it down so you get it. And so even in giving us the record, He wants us to think about what He was doing for His own glory. You know, there is no other being in the universe who has the right to make everything about himself. Any of the rest of us do that, we are supremely arrogant. But you see, God is doing this so we could see just how great He is as He unfolds this. His creation is a personal, you might almost call it high touch. I mean, have you stopped and thought about what it says about how He made man? Well, again, we'll look at that in a couple weeks. It says He breathed into him the breath of life, and he became a living soul. Do you realize that about the thing that most resembles is a kiss? God personally interacts, touches His creation. This is the incredible story of creation that sets it apart. This infinite, eternal God makes the universe and then fully invests Himself in it. To touch, to speak, to love you and me. So I don't want us to miss the personal development of this. God's creative power is great, but He is this infinite and personal God. It's why we always talk about a personal relationship with the God of the universe. I know it sounds trite, and sometimes we've said it so often, we just kind of have overused some phrases, but they start being used because they have some significance. He's personal. Now let's see this creating of creation. It says in the beginning, God created. I know you're saying, you're going word for word. Exactly how many words are there in Genesis? Well, can I tell you, words matter? Words matter. Jesus said, not one yod, not the smallest letter, not the smallest stroke of a word will pass away till my word is fulfilled. Now, we're not going to study every single word in quite this depth, but I want you to understand why we assert the things we assert based on the words that are used. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I don't want to use Hebrew words just to impress you, but some of these are important. This word here is an important word. It's the Hebrew word bara, meaning to create or to make. It is a word that is used 50-some times in the Bible, and it is only used of the activity of God. So it's a theological word. It's a word that has significance. We never read that man baras anything. Only God. It's distinct, although related to the words to form or to make, and we'll see those words later in the account. In this story, we see it in chapter 1, verse 1. God created the heavens and the earth. And that word is not used again until we get down to verse 21. Look down there. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kind, and every winged bird. So basically, he doesn't use the word created, bara, again until he gets to sentient life. I always wanted to use that word in a message. Sentient beings. I do like science fiction, so you hear it and things like that. But anyway, sentience means awareness. There's some awareness. He doesn't use it of the plants. He uses it of the great sea creatures and the things that swarm in the sea and the birds. Drop down to verse, and by the way, that then is a word that governs the next section all the way up to verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now again, something I've pointed out to you, when God uses a word over and over again, it's usually important. And in Hebrew, you emphasize things by repeating it. And when you repeated it 3 times, that was as much emphasis as you could give it. Like in the passage in Isaiah 6, the living creatures surrounding the throne. And also in Revelation, same thing. Holy, holy, holy. You say it 3 times, you're giving it a perfect, you're emphasizing it, it's like good, better, best. 3 times. Created, created, created. And if you want to really make the point, you see that he's saying, of all of creation, I want you to understand this. You, humans, were created. We need to understand what this word means. The next place it's used is at the end of the account, chapter 2, verse 3. So God blessed the 7th day, made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation, another form of the word. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth, verse 4, when they were created in the day the Lord God made earth and the heavens. So this word is used a lot in this particular account. But let me show you some of the other places it's used. Because the word has certain meanings. It means the creation of something that did not previously exist. Now we see that in 1:1, but can I show you in Isaiah chapter 43?